Thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this series. And what I'd hope to accomplish is to share a little bit about this particular community of young people that we're talking about in our schools and what the research has to tell us about their experiences. So I'd like to begin with this acronym, what we call our rainbow community or our rainbow alphabet, where every one of these initials represents an identity of students in our schools today. So I'll just pause and give you a chance to reflect to see how far you can get or if you can get them all. And so we'll start with the first four, which are probably the most common or the easiest ones, given our familiarity with this issue. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, two-spirit, transsexual, intersex, queer, questioning, asexual, ally, and pansexual. And perhaps P is the newest term, one that a lot of students are using, and we can think of P for person, where a student might be attracted to the person rather than their sexual orientation or their gender identity. Or leave it up to an 11-year-old to perhaps explain it the best. I'm attracted to hearts, not parts. So we automatically see this fluidity of sexuality and gender amongst our youth community. So rather than trying to pronounce that, and I do have a prize if you'd like to email me if you can come up with a pronunciation, we talk about this often shorthand as the LGBTQ community. Sometimes you'll see a little star on the end, which just simply means we represent the rest of the identities in that rainbow alphabet. Or what we see more formally in some of our writing and our policies is referring to this as the sexual and gender minority community, where our sexual minorities refer back to sexual orientation. So we think of gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual. Our gender minorities speak back to gender identity, both of which are protected grounds. So sexual orientation and gender identity are protected grounds in Alberta's human rights legislation. So gender minorities refer to our trans or transgender community. So this community is also called an invisible minority. And I remember a school principal some time ago who once told me there are no lesbian or gay students in my school. And my response was to go further and talk about beyond lesbian and gay, but bisexual, transgender, and queer students. But also I think the important message was there are probably no visible LGBTQ students in your school because your school may not be safe for them to be visible or reveal their identities. So this is often called an invisible minority that's directly tied to issues of safety, welcoming and inclusive communities. So we know from this particular community that many individuals won't come out until they see active signs that they're going to be welcome. So we talk about things like safe space posters and stickers that show our support. We also know that this community is a disproportionate target for violence and victimization. So the latest hate crime statistics in Canada, for example, tell us that the three most targeted groups for hate crimes in this country are the Black community, the Jewish community, and the sexual and gender minority community. So we can see the impacts of racism, of anti-Semitism, and homophobia and transphobia. And the sad reality is that of all the hate crimes committed, the ones most violent in nature are the ones that target our sexual and gender minority community. So we're not talking about one stab wound, but 40 stab wounds, where a person is not seen as a person, but as an object to be destroyed. And that's the power of stereotypes and dehumanizing or derogatory language in our society and too often in our schools. So you can see some young people get caught in a position of double jeopardy. They really want to come out and find support, but they may feel that the more likely they are to be visible, the more likely they are to be targeted for bullying or harassment. But we can tell you, despite that dilemma, research tells us it's far, far more harmful for a young person to have to hide who they are and the long-term mental health effects that has from denying your identity, not finding community or support from your friends or your families. So we should never tell a young person that they have to hide who they are because we can't guarantee their safety. You know, it's the number one responsibility of schools to provide safe, welcoming, respectful school environments. So when we see some of the trends that are happening, we know that this is a community that is coming out at much younger and younger ages. So it used to be like a decade ago where this maybe not would even be an issue in our high schools because We tell young people that, oh, just wait till you graduate and you can get to that liberal university where you can come out and be yourself. Or wait till you graduate and you can move away from your small town or community. And implicitly what we're telling them is it's not safe here for you, it's safe somewhere else. It gets better somewhere else. Where really our responsibility is to make it better now, to make it better here. No young person should simply have to survive their schooling experience. We should create school communities where they're supported to thrive. That's really what our goal is. So when we think about sexual orientation, you know, we can ask ourselves, what does the research tell us about the average age at which a person comes out to someone else? So by coming out, we're talking about that act of disclosure, that act of making the invisible visible. And they may come out to a friend, a teacher, or a family member, or a trusted adult in their life. Research tells us that happens at about age 15 or 16. So squarely, this issue is clearly now in our school environment, unlike maybe 10 years ago, where we didn't have to deal with this issue because it wasn't so visible. So that's the age when a child might come out to someone else. But the age of first awareness, what research tells us, is around age 10. So think about what happens between age 10, when you know, and age 15, when maybe you come out to someone. All those important developmental tasks that happen between the ages of 10 and 15, where you may have to conceal or hide who you truly are because you're worried that it might not be safe for you, or you might be rejected from your friends, your family, or you might be bullied at school. So increasingly, we're seeing that gap shrink. I know now proud out 10-year-olds. You know, it's quite phenomenal, and who often have the full support of their families behind them. So that's sexual orientation. If we think about gender identity, just think about and pause and reflect, when did you first become aware of your own gender? At what age? Many of us have a hard time thinking about that question because we feel that we always knew our gender, which is part of who we are. And so research tells us around age 2 that a child will become aware and be able to start naming their own gender. So if you think about our transgender community, and when many people report the first instances where their biological sex did not align with their gender identity, that internal sense of who they are, that happens around age 5 or 6. So we know we're dealing with gender identity and often gender expression issues at a very early age, often in our elementary schools. So that's a little bit about what we know about this community. I often call this community Generation Queer because it's the first generation that is now fully out in their schools. It's the first generation that often has the full support of their parents. And it's the first generation that's often fighting back when they find themselves being discriminated against by filing human rights complaints or raising concerns with their schools or other institutions that are failing to respect and protect them. So this is a generation that is more aware of its rights, being more assertive of its rights, and particularly has the support of their parents. And in particularly, this is also a generation that has changed quite quickly in Canadian society. Think back, here we are in 2016 to 2005 and what happened in Canada. We can remember that Canada became the 4th country in the world to legalize what? I'll give you a second to think if you can come up with the answer. You're right, it was same-sex marriage. Canada became the 4th country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage. And so you think about what happens when couples get married. And I know immediately some of you are thinking of divorce, but I like to be more optimistic. When couples get married, they often have families. So think about 11 years later, in 2016, what's happening to those same-sex couples that have gotten married and are starting families. Their children are entering into our school system. And those families are asking, how is the school environment going to respect, include our family in the school community? And so that means we have to become aware of the kinds of forms, the materials, the books, just like we have in our school, just like any other diverse family. We must include same-sex parented families alongside all other kinds of families in our school environment. Not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's what the law requires us to do. So we see this shifting landscape that's really becoming much more pronounced and visible in our school communities. So the question is, what does the research have to tell us about the experiences of these young people in our school communities? And I have this question for you to think about. If you think about your own school or the school that you went to, ask yourself, what is life like for LGBT youth in our schools? And if you don't know the answer to that question, well, that tells you a lot about the answer, largely marked with experiences of silence and invisibility in their school communities. So if we look at what some of the research tells us, we're fortunate here in Canada now. We have some national survey data that's been done looking at the experiences of LGBTQ youth or sexual and gender minority students in our schools. This slide talks about eGale Canada, which is Canada's national LGBT organization, that did a Safe Schools survey, climate survey, with Dr. Catherine Taylor at the University of Winnipeg as the lead researcher. And this survey was conducted in 2009, and it was sent to school boards all across Canada. And sadly, in 2009, not one school board in Canada not one school board in Alberta would participate in the survey. Thankfully, we fast forward a few years and we are seeing more school boards participate in research and now certainly passing policies. So we've seen progress in just a few short years. So what happened when school boards weren't allowing this survey research to happen is the researchers had to go where LGBT youth live. So youth groups, gay straight alliances, and the survey went online. So this survey involved 3,700 students from across Canada. And the average age was 17.4 years old, so right in that high school demographic. And it was important that not all of these students or young people came from Toronto or Montreal. We actually had a very good cross-section where 43% of the student respondents came from urban centers like Edmonton or Calgary. 46% came from smaller centers like Fort McMurray, Red Deer, Grand Prairie. And 11% came from rural and reserve communities. So think of places like Taber, Alberta, as an example. And so we have a good cross-section of respondents. So this survey found that 73% of the student respondents identified as heterosexual, 26% as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or questioning, and 3% as trans-identified. And so we know that 26% is probably a higher than average representation because we had to purposefully oversample in LGBT communities and youth groups to find these youth when we weren't able to get access into schools. So the important part here is to note that this is comparative research. So we asked all of the students the same questions and sorted their responses based on how they identified their sexual orientation or their gender identity. So we'll look at what some of that research has to say. So here's a slide that talks about the frequency of homophobic comments from all students who participated in the survey. So the green box, you can see that 70% of all students reported hearing phrases like "that's so gay" every day in their school environment. 47, almost 48% reported hearing more direct derogatory remarks like faggot, queer, lesbo, and dyke every day in their school environment. Sadly, the research also showed that 10% of the time, these very remarks were used by teachers themselves in the school. So those entrusted to protect the students were the ones using the derogatory language. So we can see that, for example, homophobic language was a predominant and prevalent concern in our schools. It's often been said that homophobic language is some of the most frequently heard derogatory language used in schools today, but the least responded to. So we have to ask ourselves, why is that? Why perhaps are educators quicker to respond to racist language than they are to homophobic, transphobic, or even sexist language? What are the barriers that are existing in our schools from interrupting or talking about homophobia and transphobia? So we did an interesting project you can look up online called nohomophobes.com to bring attention to this problem of language and derogatory language. And so we went on social media, on Twitter, and we tracked the use of those 4 derogatory terms: faggot, that's so gay, dyke, and no homo. And no homo's a word often used in rap music where 2 men can show affection to one another and hug each other so long as they say no homo afterwards. And that's designed to protect one's masculinity that isn't going to be called into question by showing traditionally feminine kinds of behaviors. So right away we see the interweaving of homophobia, sexism, and a hyper or hard or dominant masculinity that is woven together in often what we consider a toxic combination. So nohomophobes.com really started to raise global awareness. It started here in Edmonton as a project that went viral all over the world to reflect back how common homophobic or casual homophobic language is in our daily use. And thankfully, since this was launched in 2012, we're seeing a downward trend. So we think a lot of the LGBT visibility we see in society, more people are talking about the issues, is actually making people move beyond stereotypes and understand that our language has the power to create people's realities and their possibilities in life and their very identities. So this is often a tool that a lot of teachers will use with students to talk about the power of homophobic language and why we really need to interrupt it when we hear it. Because if we as educators don't interrupt this language, our silence often signals consent. And for an invisible minority, if we never hear teachers interrupting that language, they may think that you're not a safe person to talk to, even if that's not our intention. So you can see how powerful silence is in the lives of an invisible minority such as LGBT youth. So the eGale survey had some interesting findings. 1 in 5 of the LGBT students reported being harassed or assaulted in their school in the past year. So here's a little narrative that comes from some other research that's been conducted on LGBT youth. I think that is really important, and it emphasizes some of the risks that these young people are facing. This quote says, "The last time I was at school, a bully broke my wrist. Now I have to have surgery. I told the school's principal and vice principal, but they only suspended the bully for 5 days. They also told me I brought it on myself for being who I am. They said, just keep my sexuality a secret from everyone so this doesn't happen. I'm scared to go back to school because I know the boys will attack me again. I've been thinking about suicide a lot because of this. What do I do?" And that question, what do I do, is very important to think about. How would we answer and how would we provide support to a young person who brought forward those concerns? So the research from eGale Canada talks about students identifying locker rooms, washrooms, and hallways as the most dangerous spaces in schools. So think about that. Think about what's the common denominator in that experience. And often those are the spaces without teacher supervision, right? That LGBT youth identify as being the most dangerous. I remember giving a presentation and there were students from Gay Straight Alliance there, and one of them put up their hand and said, yeah, that's my reality. In my high school, when the bell rings, to get to the next class, the teacher wonders why I'm always late. And he said, I have to go out the front door of the building, and I have to walk around the entire school and come in the back door to be able to get to class, because it's not safe for me just to go through our hallways in our school. So that really, I think, emphasizes the importance of creating safe and welcoming and respectful environments for our young people in our schools. And this is still, sadly, a common reality. The next point, the third bullet, talks about 61% of students with one or more LGBTQ parents reported feeling unsafe at school. So presumably, this is the heterosexual students who come from same-sex parented families who feel targeted or bullied or harassed, not because of who they are, but because of the families that they come from. So you can really see how homophobia and transphobia impact a large majority of young people in our schools and communities today. And perhaps this last stat, the fourth bullet, is the most telling one from this research, that talks about 52, almost 53% of LGBT participants reported feeling unsafe at school, compared to only 3.4% of the non-LGBT respondents. So we see a vast discrepancy in experiences or feelings or perceptions of school safety when we compare our experiences of LGBT students with heterosexual students in their schools. So that was the eGale Canada study. A new study that's just come out is from the Toronto District School Board, and every 3 years they do what's called a student census. This is a phenomenal best practice, which I would highly encourage other school districts to follow. They ask a series of questions, and importantly, they ask demographic questions. They ask students from grades 9 to 12 to identify and give them the option to identify their sexual orientation, their gender identity, their FNMI status, their ethnocultural communities. And then what they do is they, again, can compare the responses of the various students, and they issue fact sheets on all the various diverse communities to see how well they're doing in the Toronto District School Board. And so they make this information public And every 3 years, they can see, have they improved the outcomes of these diverse students? So not only does it give us some research, it actually gives us some benchmarks to see how effective our interventions are. So here in this survey, they've done it twice now, in 2011, 2014. Both times they found that about 8% of students in grades 9 to 12 identified as LGBTQ or questioning. And that's close to what we assume in society is around 1 in 10 or 10% will be non-heterosexual. And what's really interesting about this study, this census, is it's a Toronto District School Board is one of the largest school boards in North America. So we're talking about a sample size of over 250,000 students, which really gives us the big data and the power of numbers and these statistical comparisons. So on a few categories, the student census asks specific questions. So for example, high school completion, which we know is one of the top priorities in Alberta, for example. 68% of the LGBT student respondents and versus 78% of the heterosexual students reported completing high school. Only 54% of the LGBT students reported applying to post-secondary compared to 68% of heterosexual students. So we can see a disparity here. And if we think about these two statistics, we ask ourselves, well, what's going on? And one answer might be to think about, well, if school is not a safe environment for me or supportive, why would I go, or why would I continue on to post-secondary? So we know that LGBT youth are not having positive school experiences, and so they're not likely to continue to go on to post-secondary or other technical college environment. And we know how important post-secondary education is in the lives of all people. In fact, when we think about poverty, one of the biggest pathways out of poverty is education. And we know that's a big priority right now. So if young people are not getting their education, they're being denied their education, or they're being tuned out, or they're being pushed out, or they drop out of school, we know this has lifelong impacts, not just for their economic well-being, but also for their mental health and their social well-being. So high school completion is a huge priority we should be focusing in on. And we know LGBT youth are less likely to complete, so we've got a problem there. When we think about school violence, 27% of LGBT students were threatened with violence at school, compared with only 13% of their heterosexual peers. Issues of bullying, harassment, school safety, 47% of LGBT students experienced name-calling or insults, compared with only 31% of their heterosexual students. 34% of LGBT students did not feel safe at school, compared with only 22% of heterosexual students. You're starting to see the pattern on all of these outcomes. LGBT students are faring worse than their heterosexual peers. So here, our third bullet is a really interesting one. We're starting to see the gap grow. 19% of LGBT students reported cyberbullying, compared with only 8% of heterosexual students. So this is a really interesting bullet for us to think about here in Alberta, with the School Act having changed now, talking about how every school authority has responsibility for bullying that happens on school property and off school property when they know about it, right? So think about who's overrepresented in the cyberbullying that's happening online, our LGBTQ students. So how are our bullying prevention initiatives going to target that particular issue is a question for us to think about. So the fourth bullet says 41% of LGBT students did not feel supported by teachers, compared with only 31% of heterosexual students. For me, both of those numbers are really incredibly high. Think about if 31% of students in your school did not feel supported by teachers. What's going on? Never mind the 41% of LGBT students who don't feel supported by their teachers. So if you were to ask this question in your own school district, would you be surprised by the responses that come back? Unfortunately, many school districts are not asking these kinds of questions, so we actually don't have the data to know how students are feeling or the kinds of experiences they're having. So again, that Toronto District School Board model is one we can really think about using in our own school districts to really get at some of the evidence, and then we could unpack this. We could do some focus groups with students to really get at where are the real barriers and the issues. That's the great thing about research. It points us into some of the questions that we need to examine and ask to really get at the mechanisms that are happening in our particular environments. So the last bullet is where things start to turn around in an interesting way. LGBT students were more likely to identify as peacemakers at school than their heterosexual peers. So we can stop and think about that. Why would they more likely to be those peacemakers or those ones who intervene when they see bullying or they hear the derogatory language? And some people would immediately say, well, because they've been bullied. And so they're acutely aware of the impacts, right? That's that power of empathy. They can empathize to that other student who might be targeted because that was them once as well. I think another interesting possibility might be the impact of gay-straight alliances, where students are learning those leadership skills in their school community to help to intervene in those discriminatory environments, or to go out in their school and provide education around LGBT issues. I know gay-straight alliances that are doing presentations to their staff around these issues and engaging in professional development or holding events for their peers or for their parent communities as well. So this is an interesting one to follow over time. So when they talked about issues of school participation, LGBT students were much less likely to participate in sports than their heterosexual peers. So we have to think about what's happening here in those sporting environments. And many of you will immediately think back to those dangerous spaces, right? If students are identifying locker rooms as dangerous spaces, well, why are they going to go to phys ed class? Or in some cases here, I know in Alberta, where transgender students don't take phys ed. They'll try to take it online, or they'll skip phys ed because those environments may not be inclusive of their gender identity or expression, or they simply may not be safe for them. We often know that sports can be a highly aggressive or masculinized, hyper-masculine environment. You know, we hear those things frequently, like don't throw like a girl. And so those environments then tend not to be supportive for differences based on one's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. So we know we have more work to do in our school physical education classes and programs, but also in society around sports, which is one reason why our institute is working with groups like the Edmonton Oilers and others through campaigns like Pride Tape, really to talk and change the kind of culture in sport and the kind of language that we hear. So the second bullet is interesting. It talks about LGBT students are more likely to participate in arts activities than heterosexual students. So we have to think about why are LGBT youth staying away from phys ed but flocking to the art room and the drama room. And many of you will think back to your own drama experience and said, well, that was the one place where we were expected to be someone else, where we had to get out of our own comfort zone, where we, again, had that role of empathy. And when we walk in someone else's shoes, as the adage goes, we're more likely to understand their experiences. So it's been said that the drama club was the original gay-straight alliance. And I think that was important. That was an important space, a space of refuge for many. But we have to ask ourselves and think about why the drama club is not enough, where every space in school should be a safe space where we respect young people's identities and their expressions. So we know we have more to do, but we have important lessons we can learn from the arts and drama to take into other places within our school community. So the last survey I want to touch on briefly is a brand new one that is from the University of British Columbia, some of our research partners there. It was funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research on a grant of over $2 million, the largest funding ever awarded for an LGBTQ research. And this was led by Dr. Elizabeth Saywick in the School of Nursing, who does population health research. And so we had an opportunity to partner and conduct a survey looking at the experiences of transgender youth in Canada. And so this sample size was, I believe, well over 500 participants. And so what we found was 2/3 of transgender youth experience incidents of discrimination because of their gender identity. More than 70% were victims of sexual harassment. Nearly half of the older youth, so those over 18, reported cyberbullying. Again, that bullying that happens online or through social media. Nearly 2/3 engaged in self-harming behaviors in the past year. Here we're talking about cutting, turning to drugs and alcohol as negative coping mechanisms, and more than 30% attempted suicide. And sadly, this stat really stands out for me. 70% of the transgender youth reported their families did not understand them. And so while we think a lot about the importance of working and supporting young people in our schools, we also can't forget about the importance of working alongside their families. And the goal is always to help families move from rejecting behaviors to a place where they hopefully will accept their LGBT children, but ultimately the goal is to get them to a place where they will celebrate their LGBT children for who they are. You know, and the sad reality is we're not there yet, where many families still in 2016 reject their LGBT children. We know that the number one cause of LGBT youth homelessness is family conflict. So it's often been said when the kids come out of the closet, the families go in the closet. And particularly sometimes in small communities, they're concerned about their reputation or what other people will think. And so schools, really, we have to think about a wraparound approach when we're addressing issues of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, working strongly with the young people and their families to reduce the risk factors that we're seeing and help to build that resilience, where no young person should simply have to survive in their school or their family or their community, where we support them to a place where they can thrive. So Dr. Taylor asks this question, which I think is apt for us to think about when we're reviewing these research studies. How many educators are underestimating the extent of homophobia and transphobia in their school cultures and the damage being done to students in their care? So if we think and reflect upon that question, are we underestimating the extent of homophobia and transphobia in our school cultures? The research also shows us that often the more different you are, or the more different you're perceived to be, the more dangerous school is for you, which really speaks to the power of normalization. You know, schools used to be called the normal school, where, you know, it was all about fitting in. And think about as a teenager, you know, you want to fit in, you want to be like everyone else, you want to look like everyone else, you want to have what everyone else has. And so young people learn that instead of celebrating diversity and difference, it's often something to be that we fear, and we often attack what we fear or what we don't know. So I think the number one thing that any school can do around these issues is to think about ways to bring diversity and difference into your school and into your classroom. Because, you know, the more students become comfortable with diversity and difference, the less they are to either bully, attack, ridicule it when they see it or they experience it, which really comes back to the goal of this learning series about creating welcoming, caring, and respectful schools for everyone, where we see diversity as our greatest strength rather than our biggest weakness, regardless of how young people identify. So the second last slide I have is, again, some further research. We're having a lot of conversation in the province and across the country on mental health, and rightfully so. This editorial comes from The Lancet, which is the world's leading medical authority. And they recently, in 2014, issued this editorial that talks about what they describe as a mental health crisis amongst LGBT youth. And they point to 3 areas of critical intervention. So the first area is talking about enhanced training for all mental health professionals and educators. Any training around mental health must directly include the realities and the experiences of LGBT young people, because they're vastly overrepresented in all of these negative mental health outcomes. The second area that this editorial talks about is schools should be spaces of support for LGBT youth, but too often they're not. So we need to do much more in our school environments. So things like focusing on gay-straight alliances as critical intervention and prevention sites. The third component is talking about the importance of policy support. Having direct, specific, comprehensive policies that include LGBT young people. And in Alberta, we talk about the importance of those policies not just targeting youth, but families and staff as well. And it's often said that if our LGBT staff don't feel safe in their school communities, how can we expect them to provide safe environments for other young people? So the last slide I'll leave you with are what the research tells us as 4 key factors that make a positive difference. So really thinking about what works in our school communities. The first is inclusive curriculum. So we know we have more work to do here. We think things like the halls and the walls. What are the halls, the images in the school hallways, in the classrooms, in our libraries, telling us about the diverse realities that exist around us. So too often, LGBT youth have not been included in those images in their books and their textbooks and the posters on the walls that all communicate what we often call that hidden curriculum, that invisible curriculum. We know we have the formal curriculum, the non-formal curriculum, and the hidden curriculum. So what does it mean when your history books don't include your identity? It often tells you that without a past, you have no future. So we know in Alberta we have lots of work to do around curriculum. We still don't have any curricular outcomes that specifically address sexual orientation or gender identity. And so the next important part is the role of supportive teachers. I call this the power of one. We know the research tells us that all young people need at least one trusted adult or supportive adult in their life. And unfortunately for LGBT youth, it may not be their families, but it could be their teacher, it could be the school custodian, it could be a coach, it could be a faith leader. The idea is that they have at least one person to turn to help, instead of internalizing all that stress or stigma or negative coping mechanisms, to externalize and reach out for supports. And so we hope all youth have one, but we know that they need many more. The more supportive adults you have in your life, the better your outcomes tend to be. So it often starts in schools. We know schools are the hub of communities. Schools and staff are often the first responders, where we see the first presentation of many issues, whether it's mental health or emotional distress. And we need to know where we can refer young people and their families back out into the community, because we know schools can't do it on our own. We need those community supports to work with us. Because, as the Lancet said, schools should be spaces of support for LGBT youth, but too often they're not. And the third piece, which we're really addressing right now in the province of Alberta, is the importance of a comprehensive, standalone LGBT inclusive policies. So that clearly enumerate responsibilities for everyone at all levels of the school. And we know that this is so important, that these policies don't just target students, but families and staff. Those are the three groups that are our stakeholders when we're talking about creating inclusive school communities. So we know research shows, for example, when we compare schools that have comprehensive sexual orientation and gender identity policies versus those that don't, the schools that have the policies, the LGBT youth do better, and we reduce all of those risk factors that we've been talking about through the research. So quite frankly, we know specific enumerated policies work. And so it's important that every school district have these policies, but we know policies can't just stay on a page or a website. We need to have resources and implementation plan to fully implement the policies, because what we're really talking about is cultural change. And that takes time, it takes leadership, and it takes the kind of policy support to be able to change our school cultures to become more welcoming, more respectful, and more inclusive for everyone. So the last point is all about visibility and inclusion. So we know that this is an invisible minority, so we have to signal our support. We know that spaces like gay-straight alliances don't just benefit the LGBTQ students, but research shows us that they often benefit any student who feels different in the school environment, because it's the one safe space in school where it's okay to be different, where you're not going to be judged for your difference, you're not going to be attacked for your difference. In fact, you're probably going to be celebrated for the difference that you bring in to your school community. So inclusive curriculum, supportive teachers, comprehensive policies, and thinking about ways that we can make LGBT issues visible and include our staff, students, and families in our school communities. This is what we know makes a positive difference, helps our young people move from feeling at risk to developing resiliency in their lives. And it can all happen in our school environments with support and with leadership. So thank you for joining me on this brief discussion of research factors and helping us to describe what we know about LGBT youth. And you'll notice that all of the research we talked about is Canadian-based research, which is so important that we're supporting this research to happen in our own country and here in our own province. So if you'd like more information or supports, you're welcome to visit our Institute website, and we're always there to work with any students, any families, or any staff around these issues. So thanks for your time and thanks for your attention today.